we're going to be focusing this afternoon about the problem of behavior change and what is normally referred to as compliance with policies of government. And you can think about, you can apply these concepts either to individuals or to businesses. In my presentation this afternoon, I'm going to be focusing mostly, not entirely, but mostly on individuals. At the end of the presentation is an application of this to businesses, and I'm not going to go over it in my talk just because I'd be talking all day and I want to be able to get to the cases. So we're going to be thinking about behavior change with a focus on combating corruption, because I know that that's something that's of particular interest to many people in this audience. So the starting point for a behavioral approach to promoting development is, as I said in the last session, most government policies aren't self-implementing. So we talked about some of the problems that may arise during the implementation process. But for many policies, it's actually the public who have to change their behavior in order for the policy to work. So, for example, if you want to reduce traffic deaths in Thailand, more people have to wear motorcycle helmets. It would probably help if you didn't have 6 people riding on that motorcycle in the picture there too. None of them, of course, wearing motorcycle helmets. If you want to improve community sanitation, then using community latrines for defecation rather than open defecation, a problem in many parts of the developing world, but especially in India, is a behavior change that you need to promote. Vaccination of children, sending children to school rather than having them engage in work to improve child health and human capital development are clearly behaviors that are an important part of the development process. If you want an environment which is cleaner and sustainable development, then you have to convince people and businesses not to engage in illegal land burning and logging in order to meet those goals. Other sorts of behaviors you need to change: paying taxes to ensure that government has adequate revenues in order to meet its objectives, not paying bribes to government officials. So all of these are behaviors at the individual level where governments have often very ambitious objectives about changing behavior. Compliance by business, changing the behavior of business, is also critical for achieving many governmental goals. Obeying environmental laws, not polluting. Obeying workplace safety and minimum wage laws. Obeying road safety laws. Clearly, I think the bus company in the top picture there is probably exceeding vehicle requirements. Obeying building codes so that buildings that you have put up do not topple over. This is a case in China. Obeying quality control rules in food production, especially in dairy production. Many of you are familiar with the Sanlu and the broader tainted milk scandal in China that occurred in 2008. Complying with child labor laws. Well, oftentimes there is a big gap between official policy and the reality on the ground. This picture says, Ministry of Lands, Ministry of Housing, our offices are now a corrupt-free zone. I think that any place that declares that it's a corrupt-free zone, you can probably guess is not. Obviously, non-compliant behaviors by politicians, by bureaucrats, can have some important implications for development. So corruption can inhibit and skew foreign investment. This is an editorial cartoon from the Philippines arguing that it's been held back by corruption. Informality in enterprises, something we'll be talking about with the Medellin case later this afternoon, also harms investment because small informal enterprises have difficulty accumulating significant capital to make investments. Theft of utility services removes government revenues that are needed to finance service expansion, service improvement, as we saw in the case of Hyderabad. So governments in many areas, for both individuals and businesses, are concerned about increasing government compliance. Or increasing compliance with government policies. But what do I mean by compliance? Well, it actually is both a simple and a complex issue. On the one hand, my definition is going to be fairly simple, that compliance is behavior that's consistent with government preferences that have at least been clearly articulated. Government has said, this is what we want you to do. Oftentimes, they're not very well communicated. And by compliance, I simply mean, do the actions fit with government policies, even if whether they're willing or grudging or coerced. But obviously, if they're coerced, then the costs of enforcement are likely to be substantially higher. So I said, in that sense, it's a fairly simple definition, but it's also pretty complex because government isn't always so clear about what it wants from its citizens or wants from its businesses. Sometimes government is quite insistent, quite intrusive about the expectations that it has of citizens. So don't take weapons on airplanes, right? Government is quite insistent and intrusive. And what's the compliance rate that government wants? It's not 99.9% or not 99.999%, it's 100%. And to get that, they're very insistent and very intrusive. Most other areas, they aren't quite that intrusive, but there are other policies where you can say that the intrusiveness and expectations are pretty high. Vaccinating children, sending children to school, paying taxes, all those are areas where government is pretty insistent. There are other areas, though, where I think you'd say government's expectations, it's the intrusiveness of the mechanisms that it gets to achieve its objectives are lower. You might call them moderate. So things like wearing motorcycle helmets. Most governments have laws saying that you should do it. Most governments, especially in the developing world, don't enforce it very effectively. Using sanitary toilets or latrines is another area where you might say is moderate. And then there are areas where government may say, well, we'd like you to do this, but it really doesn't have very clear policies to get you there. Things like feeding children a healthy diet. So big questions we're going to be talking about are, why do program targets sometimes behave the way that governments and program designers want, what I'll call compliance, and sometimes fail to do so. So how do we explain these differences, and what are the various strategies that government can use to try to achieve its objectives? So for example, in terms of variation in compliance, if we just look at the Asia-Pacific countries, they vary enormously in terms of the size of their informal sector, with the informal sector in Singapore estimated about 13% of the economy, in Thailand more than half of the economy. Also tremendous variations in corruption, again looking at the Asia-Pacific region with New Zealand and Singapore both being rated very highly in terms of clean government by Transparency International, and countries like Laos and Myanmar down near the bottom. Another question you can ask is, even though most governments have made clear that they want people to stop smoking, people continue to smoke even after they've been exposed to graphic anti-smoking campaigns. And in some countries, tax evasion is clearly endemic, but again, much more in some countries than in others. This is a graphic from The Guardian listing the number of people who declare incomes of less than 20,000 euros a year, and 188,000 of them own BMWs, Ferraris, Mercedes, etc. 518 of them own private planes and helicopters. 42,000 of them own yachts. I think that's probably a fairly generous definition of yachts, but still, that's a lot of sizable boats to be owned by people who declare an annual income of less than 20,000 euros a year. Another area to think about compliance in is gender ratios at birth, a serious problem, and particularly in countries like China and India, where again we see gender ratios at birth that are very highly skewed in some societies, but not in others. And governments in both China and India have enacted policies that are attempt to put a damper on gender-selective abortion, but of course in both countries it's legal to have the prenatal testing, it's legal to have the abortions, it's just not legal to convey the information about the gender of the fetus. And I'm going to talk about that a little later as a monitoring problem that interferes with the ability to get compliance. So governments, international financial institutions, all sorts of actors want to know, how can we get people to behave? This is 3 recent reports. Of course, you're familiar with the World Bank report, another one from the OECD, a third one that just came out from the European Union. So the core arguments I'm going to be making in this talk are, first of all, we need to think about a variety of barriers that keep individuals and businesses from complying. Behavioral economics has focused on informational barriers and cognitive barriers, and clearly those are important, but I'm going to argue you need to think beyond that set of barriers to a broader set of barriers to understanding why individuals and businesses don't comply. Second general argument is that for most policies, the target populations of those policies are heterogeneous, okay? They have different characteristics, and therefore they're not going to all respond to any set of policies in the same sort of way. And that target heterogeneity is an important contributor to non-compliance. Third major argument is that there are a variety of instruments that governments can use to try to address problems of non-compliance, and that what governments and those who are trying to help them need to figure out is what's the appropriate instruments to use, and what are the best settings on those instruments to get an acceptable rate of compliance. Okay, so that's kind of a general introduction. So think in particular about multiple barriers, think about heterogeneous target populations, think about several different instruments that can be used. So let me go through those in a little bit more detail. So why don't firms and individuals comply with government policies? I'm going to talk about 8 different sources of compliance gaps, or what you might call 8 barriers to compliance. And these can be divided into 3 kind of broad sets of categories. One has to do with beliefs, one has to do with an economic calculus, don't need to comply, and the third has to do with capacity. The target population may want to comply, but they're unable to do so. So let me go through the 8 barriers divided into those 3 categories fairly quickly. A first explanation, first potential barrier to compliance is what can be called cognition and information barriers. Targets may lack the information that would make compliance more likely. So this is an advertisement from the early days of the Thai campaign against the spread of HIV, and they thought that in many cases people simply don't know how HIV is spread, what safe behaviors are and what unsafe behaviors are, and so in a
relatively graphic, but still stick figure-y kind of way, they tried to convey that information. So that's a simple lack of information. But as behavioral economics has shown us, we also have lots of biases in the way that we process information, and this has behavioral consequences. I'm sure most of you are familiar with this, so I'm not going to dwell on it, but the fact that we have both an automatic system and a reflective system. An automatic system it tells us to do things without us really thinking about it. A reflective system, we have to stop. As Daniel Kahneman said, it's a slower system rather than a faster system, but usually produces better decisions. But the automatic system requires less brain capacity and does it faster. We have anchoring effects, we have rules, we use rules of thumb, we tend to be more sensitive to information that we've gotten recently. So for example, if there's been a recent tsunami, we worry more about tsunamis than when there hasn't been a tsunami, even if we live in places like Washington, D.C., where the tsunami risk is likely to be somewhat less than zero. And this can lead individuals to have certain biases in the way we make decisions. So again, we act on the basis of inertia. We rely heavily on default options, that is to say, what happens if we don't make an active choice, which most of us don't do. And we particularly tend to rely on defaults if there are lots of alternatives, the default option appears to be acceptable, and it costs a lot to gather information. A classic example is for academics, for example, who make decisions when they take a job with a university. They can usually revise their retirement investment decisions every year if they want to, and the most common modal number of times that people change their allocation of funds is 0. That is to say, we could change every year, but we say, I'll do it later. What sorts of things do? We follow the herd, we procrastinate, we're myopic, that is to say, we discount future costs and benefits severely relative to those that are in the present. So we may say, oh gee, I'm really concerned about my weight, but that donut looks really good, so I'll start my diet tomorrow. And we're loss averse. We're more sensitive to losses than to gains. Okay, so again, this is familiar to all of you, I'm sure. That's why I'm not dwelling on it here. But let's just think about some applications of this to one particular area, which is fighting corruption. So what are some of the ways that information and cognition barriers can affect government efforts to reduce corruption? Well, bribe payers, for example, don't often know the rights that they have to services, that they're entitled to have services for free. Let's say getting drugs in a hospital. Bribe payers may not know the true cost of fines. So in India, for example, my son, who's a development economist, worked on an experiment where police were saying, well, you can either pay the fine, or you can just give me 200 rupees. And most people said, well, I'll give you 200 rupees, not realizing that the fine was in fact only 50 rupees. So there are information asymmetries. Bribe payers often don't know how to report solicitation of bribes or do so in a way that's safe. And in general, they're afraid to take the risk of not paying bribes because there's uncertainty about what the consequences will be. So again, information and cognition barriers play across all behaviors and are a major contributor to lack of compliance. A second kind of barrier are attitudes and objectives barriers, and these again can take several different forms. One very common barrier, particularly in developing countries, is policy targets are very hostile toward or mistrust government agencies, government programs. So take the example of in the early 2000s, the breakdown of the polio vaccination campaign in northern Nigeria, which had very complex roots. But one of the causes of it was a mistrust of government. In many cases, individuals may feel that a policy is being unfairly or unjustly applied to them. So think about in the United States the perception on the part of many minority communities that the police are unfairly applying laws to them. Third kind of attitudes and beliefs root of noncompliance is the policy that government has put in place may conflict with deeply held beliefs. And here, the strong preference for sons in some societies, which also, of course, has roots in incentives, the belief that it is more economically worthwhile to have sons and daughters, has led in some societies to both female infanticide and to illegal gender selective abortion. And again, attitudes and beliefs may play a role in contributing to corruption. For example, that offering gifts to service providers may be acceptable in some cultures and not acceptable in others. A third sort of barrier that fits in with this general category of information and beliefs has to do with peer effects. And a lot of research on this has been done by social psychologists like Robert Cialdini. And the idea is that individuals are less likely to comply where compliance by others, what's often referred to as the descriptive norm, seems low. So for example, if you're living in a society where nobody else pays taxes, why should I? Or everybody else takes or pays bribes, why shouldn't I? It's because you're sort of seen as foolish in this situation. If you don't do what other people are doing, you're putting yourself at a disadvantage. Again, an application to corruption, the widespread perception in many countries that corruption is endemic, and that if you don't engage in it, it's likely to be costly to you, tends to fuel corruption. Okay, so we have this first category, which has to do with basically information and beliefs. So information and cognition, attitudes and beliefs, and thirdly, peer effects. But there's a second category that is a little closer to the concerns of traditional economics, and I want to argue that we shouldn't forget them because they are probably the most important source of noncompliance. And the idea behind the first one of these, incentives problems, is that there may just not be, and here we can start off thinking about what the formal rules are, but there may not be in the formal rules enough positive incentive or negative incentives to produce compliance. So, for example, families may believe that child labor, which increases immediate family income, is, even though it may lower your child's human capital development and earnings power in the future, we need that income now. Or they may believe that, in fact, the investment in education in their children isn't likely to produce an income. So, and obviously incentive effects take many different forms. That's just one example. But I want to argue that we shouldn't just think of incentives in terms of formal rules. There are two other things that are absolutely critical to understanding the overall effect of incentives. And a second factor is monitoring problems, that it's harder to get high rates of compliance when compliance is difficult or costly to monitor. So think about things like polio vaccinations, where with oral vaccine, there's no mark that's left. So it's very difficult to make sure that kids have gotten the 3 to 5 vaccinations they need to provide immunity. unless you have a good record-keeping system in the schools, for example, and you want to get the kids before they get to school. Think about payment of income tax by street vendors. Well, and in theory, you could have one tax inspector following every street vendor around to make, to get an accurate, indicator of their income. But obviously, that would be pretty inefficient. So we don't do that.